All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 29, Section 3, A New India, 1905 to 1947. So this section in particular is all about India's independence. That is going from a British-controlled colony to an independent nation. And during British occupation, there were certain aspects of Indian culture that were heavily influenced by Britain's presence. One example of this was the widespread use of English language, which became very widespread. Interestingly enough, the largest English-speaking country in the world today is India, and that goes to show kind of the impact that Great Britain had. So we'll say that this was widespread, and especially true amongst the educated classes, educated or elite classes. However, there were certain aspects of Indian culture and society that were not as affected by Britain's presence. One good example was the caste system, or sometimes referred to as the jati. A caste is kind of like a social community in some ways. A lot of it was based off of occupation or job. And within the caste system, within these various communities, it was very strongly discouraged from either marriage, especially marriage, or interactions with other castes. We talked about in a previous chapter one of the lowest castes in Indian society, and that was the untouchables, typically involved with professions that were not considered very, very desirable. Maybe it required handling garbage or waste, or maybe the handling of like human corpses, graveyards, stuff like that. So very, very rigid in terms of social structure, not a lot of social mobility. Typically the professions that a person is born in is the profession that they'll have for the rest of their lives, and it's the profession that their children will have for the rest of their lives. The caste system ends up being one of the obstacles to India's independence, or India's unity, I would say. Certainly not the most important one, though. Under colonial India, especially after, and recall we went over this in a different chapter, 1857, the Sepoy Rebellion. Sepoys were Indian soldiers who fought on behalf of Great Britain. They rebelled in 1857. In 1858, the British defeated them and established a much stronger and direct rule over India. Example of this was the Queen of England giving herself or granting herself the title Empress of India. So more or less a brief just kind of rundown of how the political structure was in colonial India. A viceroy was appointed by the British government. He was like, in some cases, he was the ruler of India, or at least, he was sort of highest on the chain of command. But when the British became much more involved after the Sepoy Rebellion, they also created a much more direct control over India, over its governance and administration, the Indian Civil Service. So this might be, I think the textbook says about 1,000. It might be far more than that, government workers. And what's to note is that most of the members of the Indian Civil Service are English, right? These are not people actually from India, although the Indian Civil Service over time does open up a little bit more towards, especially those people in India who are Western educated, but for the most part, they're dominated by people of England. The viceroy is always English, of course. And one of the major concerns, you might say, or one of the major goals for Great Britain and India to do is to protect British industry. So about British industry, we want to say that policies in India protected, right, British industry. And so one example of that would be, not to allow, so something like steel, we'll say Indian steel. Great Britain wanted to maintain an economic advantage when it came to the production of steel. So any effort by people in India to create their own steel and not to buy it from the British, that was actively discouraged. So that would have been a way that the British protected their economic interests and really guarded their own businesses. Now, for a number of reasons, we talked about the creation of an Indian nationalist group, the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885. This was mostly Western educated, upper class Hindus, right, who made up the Indian National Congress. And of course, their goal from a very early period, 1885, was Indian independence. That is to break free from British rule. However, though, during the years between 1905 and a little bit earlier than that, there wasn't really a lot of momentum in terms of making considerable progress. Of course, the Indian National Congress was important in being created, but it wasn't very influential, at least at this time. The sort of fire, you might say, of nationalist sentiment really becomes engulfed in 1905, hence the starting point here. And that was with Great Britain's decision to partition the territory of Bengal, which is located in India. And the partitioning of Bengal by England was done in order to make it easier to administer. However, this was done without any Indian consent. And the fact that Great Britain could simply just divvy up and divide the territory of India without actually consenting anyone from India, from the National Congress or otherwise, was reason to protest and demand more self-governance. This also led to other minority groups feeling that the Indian National Congress maybe ought not to be the only nationalist group, and ultimately led to the formation of the Muslim League, which was sort of a counter to the National Congress. The Muslim League was created to protect Muslim interests in India. Recall that in India, Muslims may be made up, and I think your textbook says 25%, although I think that number is a little bit high. Some of the numbers I've heard is 15% and 85%, but nonetheless, Muslims are certainly in the minority, and they want their voices to be heard in an organization, that is not just dominated by Hindus, and thus gives rise to probably the single most important problem for India's independence movement, and that is the division between the two religious groups, Muslims and Hindus. So we might say divided on the question of independence. All right. And it's a matter of overcoming not just the religious differences, but also a matter of overcoming some of the social differences in the caste system that, again, is going to prove to be a barrier. Now, when World War I broke out, like we mentioned in the chapter on World War I, when those major countries went to war, their colonies also went to war. Many people in India supported Great Britain's effort in the war, hoping that there would be some concessions. 1 million Indians served in the war for Great Britain. And after the war, like we mentioned before at the Paris Peace Conference, much like a lot of other people around the world, most colonial possessions were pretty disappointed. Nothing really of substance came out of World War I for the Indian population. Great Britain still retained heavy control over the subcontinent. To make matters worse, the nationalist sentiment was increasing. The British made it illegal for large groups of Indians to gather. This was against British law, fearing that it might stoke some sort of rebellion. At Amritsar, I think Amritsar, I've been saying it wrong. The Amritsar massacre was carried out by the British General Dyer. He was a British general. When British authorities gave a large gathering of Indian nationalists, gave them an ultimatum of leave or be fired upon. And actually, that's not even correct. As far as I recall, the Amritsar, right? Amritsar, I gotta make sure I'm saying that correctly. The Amritsar, so there was a well-known gathering of Indian nationalists, and General Dyer ordered the army to essentially trap these individuals in a courtyard and opened fire upon them. And in this courtyard, there was a giant well. And so approximately 400 people died as a result of this massacre ordered by the British General Dyer. There in the courtyard, there was, for the people who weren't shot to death, all the exits were blocked so the people couldn't get out. And there was also a giant well in the middle. And so some people jumped in the well to avoid the gunfire and ultimately jumped to their death. This was a pretty big turning point, I would say, in the nationalist movement in India. Really, before we can look at things like Indian support of World War I and say, for the most part, there was an effort by India to work side by side with Great Britain in hopes of getting concessions. The Amritsar massacre proved that no matter how cooperative Indian nationalists were with the British, they weren't going to be given any concession, and even worse, they were going to be met with simple massacres. And so this led to, again, a big shift, we might say, from kind of a cooperation. Again, when you think about cooperation, think World War I, to a non-cooperation. And that meant really to resist Great Britain, and the Amritsar massacre, or Amritsar massacre was the example of this. And it's in this circumstance which, gives rise to not only the most well-known Indian nationalists at the time, but perhaps the most well-known nationalists in the history of the world. And that is Mahatma Gandhi, or as his name is, Mohandas Gandhi, Mahatma being a title given to him meaning great soul. And his somewhat unusual tactic, I would say, and that was non-violence, which in the long run ended up being effective. Mohandas Gandhi was very much cut from the same cloth as many in the Indian National Congress. He was, we'll say middle upper class. He was Western educated. He went to England and got his degree, and he was a Hindu, right? So again, these kind of all are pretty characteristic of those who were demanding independence at the time. Mahatma, this was of course the title, great soul, that sometimes Gandhi was referred to. But after Gandhi was educated in Europe, he spent a little bit of time in South Africa. He eventually made it back to India and pushed for Indian independence, kind of using these principles, Ahisma and Satyagraha. These were, we might say, the principles which guided Gandhi and India's independence. All right. Like I mentioned before, he was Western educated, and one thing that he did to embrace, Indian, not just the Indian economy, but really culture, was to encourage homespun clothing. You see it very clearly in the way that Gandhi is dressed, wearing the traditional garb that one would wear in India. If you see some younger pictures of Gandhi, he's typically wearing sort of a Western style dress, a collared shirt and stuff like that. But this was a way to, on the one hand, embrace Indian culture, but on the other hand, this was a political and economic movement, because the homespun cloth and the idea of India spinning its own cloth was to boycott British textiles and support Indian business. Remember, Great Britain is an industrial nation and has not technically a monopoly, but it's very powerful, and it really wants to create an Indian economy. Again, going back up to this point about protecting British industry, it wants to create an Indian economy that only exports cotton, so then it can be processed in Great Britain, and Britain can reap all the benefits from that. And so this was, again, it was cultural, it was social, it was economic, and it was political. Gandhi's tactics were incredibly effective. Some of his more famous ones include the Salt Walk, or the Salt March, and fasting. The Salt March was a march to the sea, again gaining a huge audience. This is what the Salt March is. I forgot exactly how many miles it was, but it was a very long march, and it started off with kind of a small group of people, but as they marched closer and closer and closer to the sea. More and more and more people moved there. And the idea was to march to the sea and pick salt. Salt was one of those commodities in which Great Britain made it illegal for people in India to buy salt from anybody besides the British, and even harvesting or picking your own salt was illegal. Now, of course, there was no kind of economic practicality here. It wasn't like people were going to pick their own salt to consume it, but it was a matter of protest and boycott, and to put Great Britain on the wrong side of the moral and ethical cause. And that's really where Gandhi shined. He went on fasting and hunger strikes. He was arrested multiple times, spent 6 years in jail, and all of these things, of course, this stressing this point of nonviolence. All of these things made India kind of the moral and ethical superior. It was very clear in these instances that something as harmless as picking salt from the ocean and getting arrested for that, it was very clear that Gandhi was on the right side of this. And what this did, not only were these effectives in the eyes of outsiders, but probably the most important part of Gandhi's contribution to the independence movement was that he turned this movement from a middle class, right, Hindu, educated, right, kind of secular, and he turned this into a mass movement that brought it to the poor, right, that brought it to the illiterate, right. He brought everyone in, brought it to all castes, right. That's one important thing to stress about this, about the Indian National Congress that perhaps we should mention here, was that the ultimate goal of the Indian National Congress, and we'll write it up here, was to create an India for all Indians, right? An India for all Indians. And that meant no matter what caste, no matter what religion, no matter what creed it was, that you belong at the table. I would say probably the one thing that Gandhi really failed to do to bridge the gap, or which gap he, and again, I wouldn't really put it on him necessarily, was that the divisions between Muslims and Hindus were still pretty somewhat significant. But he brought in the poor, the illiterate, the members of lower castes. Gandhi would interact with people of members of the lower caste and turn this into a mass public movement. Now, the pressure was certainly on Great Britain. In the 1920s, Great Britain did grant some limited concessions. More people from India played a role in the civil service government. Another important leader arose, and that was well, we usually just call him Nehru. Let's see, Jawahar. I don't know how to pronounce his first name, sorry. But Nehru, right? And Nehru was somebody who, maybe unlike Gandhi on the economic front, wanted to invest in modern industry, and that was to create an industrial economy, right? One thing that that Gandhi really was, Gandhi was very much like a spiritual leader. Nehru, we might say, was more practical, right? Practical. And during World War II, India was faced with a really tough decision, and that was to, support Britain. Again, recall the history in India. Recall Indian support for World War I and how they were met by the British with essentially massacre and no concessions being gained. So the question was, should India and Gandhi support Great Britain in World War II? And in that respect, India was somewhat divided. Members of the Indian National Congress and Gandhi himself demanded immediate independence. Again, the idea to quit India meant to grant independence immediately. The British were willing to grant it, or at least said they were willing to grant it after the war was over. And so ultimately, Gandhi and the National Congress chose not to support Great Britain in that war. Again, a very tough decision to make. many people in India did support Great Britain. It was after 1945, when the war was over, that independence came. However, there was still a big division between Hindus and Muslims. Muhammad Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, League. Muhammad Jinnah, leader of the Muslim League, was concerned that an independent India, if the British just simply packed their bags and left, that an independent India would lead to a disproportionate control that, I don't know why I put India here, this should be Hindus, that 85% of the Hindu population would suppress the minority population. And so what Jinnah proposed was a two-state solution. Eventually, that's what the British went with, and they created two countries, India and Pakistan. The idea was that India was to be the country for the Hindu population. Pakistan was supposed to be for the Muslim population. And in the eyes of Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, the two-state solution was actually what we might say, a defeat. It's not what they wanted. They wanted one India for all Indian people. This led to conflict and migrations, ultimately resulting in 500,000 dead. There was religious warfare and conflict between Hindu and Muslim populations. Essentially what occurred was that, if you look at the partition of India, Pakistan's here in the green, India's here in the yellow. And if you were a Hindu on this side of the border, you wanted to migrate over here. If you were a Muslim on this side of the border, you wanted to migrate over here. And there was a lot of, again, movement, migrations. I think it's actually the largest mass migration in one single instance in all of human history. And a lot of conflict. Even Gandhi himself was killed in the aftermath of partition and assassinated by what we might call a what do you call it when you don't quite get what you want? Non-compromise Hindu, who didn't like the fact that he wasn't being more religiously militant, you might say. And, in the successive years, the territory of Kashmir, so this is a territory in India with a large Muslim population and important resources. This has been a territory that both India and Pakistan have fought over really ever since 1947. The territory is up in this region right here. This is the Kashmir. And so, from 1947 even up until today, the tension between India and Pakistan has been very great. And, at least on 3 occasions, the two countries have gone to war with each other.